Beloved, it is good to be here with you in this sanctuary and with our friends who are joining us online. What a day it is this morning, coming off of yesterday's Women's March in Morristown, New Jersey, with what I hear was 15,000 participants at the latest count. How many folks were out marching somewhere? How many folks were lending your support online? I saw some tweeting happening. Thank you. Thank you, one and all. It's very good to see you this day, especially because I have been busy all week long getting my homework ready for this morning. In anticipation of our theme, dealing with difficult people, I've been thinking about people that irritate me. So I've got my list ready. That was the point, right? We were going to talk about difficult people and name them. I even did some bonus homework, and once I finished my list of names, I spent the remaining days of my week making a list of warning labels I think people should have. And I came up with some good ones, if I do say so myself. Warning, chews loudly and slurps boldly. Warning, explains everything as slowly as a sloth. Warning, takes your idea and claims it, then receives gratitude from the group for it. Warning, won't do the work, will do all the criticism. Warning, inexplicably hums during meetings. Then I reread the poem that I just read by David Sullivan, and after a proper fight with my wife that likely had to do with my low blood sugar and maybe pregnancy, I thought, what's my warning label? In my experience, many of us don't learn great modes of moving past irritation and toward identifying one another's warning labels. Some of us, perhaps you're like me, you've grown up with the Barney model of I love you, you love me, we're a loving family. I once entitled a sermon about conflict, I love you, you love me, now just be quiet. We all learn approaches to dealing with difficult people. Some approaches we absorb in our families of origin or in the wider culture. Some even develop as customs, like the old story of the young scholar from New York who was invited to become a rabbi in a small, old community in Chicago. And on his very first Shabbat, a hot debate erupted as to whether one should stand or sit during the reading of the Ten Commandments. The next day, the rabbi visited a 98-year-old member, Mr. Katz, in a nursing home. Mr. Katz, I'm asking you, as the oldest member of our community, what is our synagogue's custom during the reading of the Ten Commandments? Why do you ask? Said Mr. Katz. Well, the rabbi responded, yesterday we read the Ten Commandments, and some people stood and some people sat, and the ones standing started shouting at the ones sitting, and then the ones sitting started shouting back at the ones standing, telling them to sit down. The old man paused. Well, that, he said, is our custom. But in a community based in covenant, in relationship, what becomes our chosen custom? And how do we move away from the customs that seem to follow us against our best intentions? At General Assembly, Brian Stevenson, when talking about justice and social change, said that one of the primary ways to achieve justice was first to have a practice of getting proximate, getting close. This resonated with me, and I've been thinking a lot about covenantal justice and getting proximate. Years ago, I dated a geologist. I promise this relates. And for exactly one summer, when the winds of love carried me away, I agreed to be a lab assistant. I learned a lot about rocks and formations and how the earth was formed, and specifically studying something she was looking at called conodonts. They could tell you, as I understand it, how quickly a body of water cooled in prehistoric times, which told you something about climate change in prehistoric times. Different species would indicate different water temperatures, and I'm oversimplifying this a bit, but essentially, I spent a summer helping to procure prehistoric microscopic eels with teeth. Now, I know this sounds like a glorious endeavor, but let me disabuse you of any illusion of that. It started out terribly promising when we arrived at the vistas from which we would collect rock samples. They were stunning out across Colorado and New Mexico, these beautiful landscapes. They became slightly less stunning after 8 or 10 hours getting rocks. The endeavor became even less mysterious and awe-inducing as we had to carry buckets of rocks back to the lab. And then it became really less interesting when I found out that the lab was in a basement and was filled with all sorts of creatures that seemed to crawl about. I did have a moment of excitement when I found out that after carrying these rocks that I had grown a certain amount of hatred for, that we were going to get to pour acid on them. That seemed like a silver lining. But after the acid was poured and we allowed the mixture to sit, it just became a murky mess. I couldn't sort it out. But of course I had to. I had to sift. And so the sifting process began. And then heavy liquids were brought in to separate out the conodonts. And here's where it finally gets interesting. Almost. We had to sit in the lab for hours and hours and watch this mixture that was in heavy liquids, making sure it didn't dry out. So it was underneath a hood, and you had to keep checking to make sure in the process that you added enough of the chemical mixture and that you kept it sealed. And after about 14 hours taking shifts in the lab, this love interest of mine said, "It's time." Nothing appeared to have changed to me, except maybe my sanity. But then she took the mixture and sifted it out, and we got, from these buckets of rocks in these huge vistas, a sample size about the tip of a pencil eraser. She took the sample and put it on a slide and then put that under the microscope. Nope. 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 I waited to find the toothy eel. And then, come here, look at this. Look at this. And if I could describe to you how an eel filled with a mouth of teeth could be beautiful, I would. But I can't. So you're just going to have to take my word for it. They were like works of modern art. The spiny shape that indicated that this was not just a grain of sediment, but this was a prehistoric creature that had been captured in a moment in time, and we were looking out across eons. They were beautiful. And that's when I developed what I like to call my geological theory of human relationship. In many experiences of people, I think we start with a vista, the lovely formation, right, that seems alluring, that is slightly lost in details, perhaps, when we first encounter it at a distance. And we may even be intrigued by this vista, or in some rare cases, awed. And this interest, well, it begs us to get closer. But then we enter the carrying rocks phase. And we get hot and tired and irritated. And we are all too happy at some point in time when we get a bit too close to pour acid on these rocks. And this is where it becomes complicated, because easily in this phase, everything can look like a murky mess. And few relationships, in my experience, if they hit the murky mess, make it past the mud stage. But the rare ones involve intense times of sifting and hours in the lab waiting for the moment. And for some fortunate encounters with one another as human beings, we'll get close enough to see the beauty of a toothy eel. But not often. Too often we stay at the vista, or we drop the buckets. As Charles Schulz famously scripted for Linus to say in Peanuts, "I love mankind. It's people I can't stand." We are a faith intimately about loving one another, but when you get close, the trouble is that for many of us, we get repelled, and that's all we know how to deal with. We can build up a hearty resistance to people. Now, I'm not talking about folks who are clearly abusive or dangerous, but the much more common, everyday experience of the human being who irritates you, or the one you just don't like, or the one that says things in a way that triggers something in you, as Ron very hypothetically described in a hypothetical covenant group. Has anyone ever had this experience? Mm-hmm. No. You just love everyone, right? And it's easy. Even ministers, you might be surprised, develop some good tactics in avoiding people or isolating from those that they believe might be difficult. And even ministers, I think, should come with warning labels. Amen? Mm-hmm. Just making sure you're still there. I'm not asking you to list those warning labels at the present moment. One of the blessings of being a minister, though, is that you're called in to offer the memorials for people that you truly loved and, well, those that you found a little harder to love. It's not something they ever tell you in seminary, how to do a memorial for someone that you found incredibly difficult. And to honor their life with equal worth and dignity as you would any other life, including the lives of those you cherished. So, when I was in my first settlement, the first memorial I did was someone that was absolutely cherished and beloved, and I kind of thought I was getting good at memorials. I did quite a few, and there's something that's an incredible honor, right, about learning about someone's life, about meeting with the people that were closest to them, and trying to sometimes reconcile these stories into a narrative to minister to those who are in mourning, but also to celebrate what someone has done and what lessons they might leave behind. But then I had this congregant, who we'll call John. And John was just one of those folks who was endlessly, difficult. He regularly wanted to meet with me, and I would always sort of tense up, I noticed, when he called and he wanted to meet. Because every time we met, we had the same conversation. It began with wondering why I wasn't living closer to the congregation, why I lived as far away as I did, 20 minutes, but let's not go there, and that my time on the highway was surely making it more likely that I was going to get in a car accident. Never mind that years after he died, he actually was correct about that. But at the time, I found it very irritating. And from here, he would go on to share how he didn't like how a particular facilities and grounds project had been completed. Now, mind you, it had been 15 years, and there was no way we were undoing the project. But every time we met, we had to go back through the story of how it hadn't been done the way in which it should be done, and that one day a massive hole was going to erupt in the earth and swallow up the congregation. And I found this a difficult conversation to have the first time, but I found it an excruciating conversation to have the 12th time. And so, when John passed away, and I was called in to begin to ready the memorial, I learned a few things that I had never gotten quite close enough to learn. I had kept my distance. And so I didn't know about John's incredible history in our faith and deep connection to building several congregations across the country. I probably hadn't listened with care for the notes of sorrow for the ways in which he was estranged from his family. And so when it came to time for the memorial service and we realized that there might only be 10 or 20 people in attendance, a certain amount of pain sunk in that I had buffered myself from someone that probably just had an awful way of trying to be in relationship. After the memorial, there was something I hadn't thought about because it had never come up. There was no one to take John's ashes. And so the funeral home delivered them to me. And so this irony, right, of me wanting to avoid having to go see John, and now there he was in my office. And there were many things they taught you in seminary, but what to do when you're responsible for someone's ashes and there's no one else is not something that was covered. And so for months, I just would walk in my office and talk to John and say good morning and not really knowing what to do next. I kept digging for pieces of his life, and eventually I found someone, kind of a long-lost love, that he had been in contact with decades ago, who didn't even know that he died. And so when I called her and I told her, she immediately said, well, he had this lake that he loved. I mean, could we go out there and spread ashes? And of course I realized that it was against the law, but the alternative was that John was eternally going to travel with me, and so that didn't seem a great solution. And so there we were, these two people who suddenly were very proximate because of a man I didn't take the time to know. My entire ministry, I suspect, I will regret not opening up my heart enough to have room to know John's story. There are so many questions now I want to ask him. So many conversations that we had with his ashes that were incomplete. The heart must stay open for transformation, and ministers are no exception. The Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams writes that church is where you get to practice what it means to be human. So here's the secret of being human together. We have to get closer. We have to get proximate in a way that takes years, and for some of us means we have to learn a way of being that we have not been taught. We don't really know in popular culture anymore how to be together in communities, what inclusion really means, and how to discern between danger and injury and the places in ourselves where we need to grow. I wish I could promise, for example, that this sanctuary and this congregation was going to be an emotionally safe place. But in undoing centuries of divisions, claiming to be a covenantal religion, a faith based in relationship, is dangerous. There's risk involved in getting close. But on the other hand, a vista may be beautiful, but there is equally no safety in the distance from the mountain. because we are tied into this earth together in what Dr. King called an inextricable network of mutuality. And if we don't develop the spiritual discipline to move beyond the warning labels of irritation or the sheer indifference with which we number ourselves, then no matter what we do here or profess here, it won't matter. It will be hollow. For this is what an embodied love means. Learning deeply what it means to be human together. I want to share with you the words of Reverend Teresa Soto in her poem, Now I Love You, Now I Witness. I know sometimes you get cranky, and sometimes your tea gets cold before you can drink it. Sometimes the news is too much, the resistance seems too little. That's real. But we are here, imperfect and together and reaching. You can hold my hand if you want. I washed it with soap. It's okay. In this kind of time, now is better than later. Now I love you. Now I am sorry it hurts. Now I witness your struggle and mine. Sometimes one answer is to be a yes in the face of every no. And I am a yes for you. Now and again. Later, if you need me. Beloved, let us be a yes for one another. In the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, we are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, and we are each other's magnitude and bond. And so, yes, I do love you. And I believe you love me. So let us now learn together about the world that yet can be. Blessed be